Today, we are going to discuss about the doctrine of suffering, dukkha, in Theravada Buddhism. Buddhism is the teaching of Lord Gautama Buddha, who lived and taught in northern India in the 6th and 5th century before Christ. Now, Lord Gautama Buddha was born into a royal family as Prince Siddhartha in a place called Lumbini in the present-day Nepal. Being a royal prince, he grew up with all the royal comforts. But he was prevented from seeing any human suffering outside the palace. However, when he was a young adult, he was witnessing human suffering in all forms, such as old age, illness, and death. And when he came to know that this human suffering is common to all human beings, including himself and his loved ones, and that alarmed and shocked him. And he wanted to find a way out of suffering. So at the age of 29, Prince Siddhartha left home and became a homeless ascetic. For the next 6 years, he practiced severe austerity and self-mortification, believing that it will bring enlightenment and liberation from suffering. And during those 6 years, he was supported by 5 ascetic companions called Kondanya, Badya, Vappa, Mahanama, and Nafsaji. Due to his severe austerity and self-mortification, ascetic Siddhartha became severely emaciated. He nearly died. But it did not bring enlightenment or liberation from suffering that he was expecting. So he gave it up. And he then started meditating, sitting under a tree in Bodh Gaya in India. He meditated on in-breath and out-breath, that is Anapana Sati Bhavana. And he was successful. He eradicated all mental defilements and realized the Four Noble Truths with no assistance from any teacher. So at the age of 35 years, he attained enlightenment as a Samma Sambuddha. Having enlightened as a Samma Sambuddha, the Buddha wanted to teach his doctrine and the path of liberation that he discovered to others so that they can also cultivate the same path and liberate from suffering. So Buddha traveled to a place called Varanasi in India and delivered his first sermon called Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, meaning turning of the wheel of truth, to the 5 ascetic companions who had supported him during the 6 years of his severe austerity, and self-mortification. The four noble truths that the Buddha realized are the truth of suffering, dukkha satya, truth of the origin of suffering, samudaya satya, truth of the cessation of suffering, nirodha satya, and truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, magga satya. Now, the Pali word dukkha is difficult to be translated into English language. Several terms have been used, such as suffering, stress, unsatisfactoriness, pain, sorrow, misery, imperfection, dissatisfaction, unhappiness. But generally, it is translated as suffering, which really does not convey the exact meaning of the Pali word dukkha. And because it is difficult to translate into English, some Buddhist scholars have even suggested that we continue with the Pali word dukkha instead of suffering. Now, during the process of enlightenment, the Buddha also realized the three universal characteristics of all physical and mental phenomena. And that is, everything in this universe is impermanent, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and there is no permanent entity, anatta. But due to our ignorance and our perverted thinking, we consider impermanent as permanent, suffering as satisfactory and pleasurable, and not self as self. Now, the Buddha's first noble truth is that there is unavoidable, inevitable, and universal suffering in the world, both physical suffering and mental suffering. The Buddha said, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, grief, pain, despair are suffering. Association with what one dislikes is suffering. Separation from what one likes is suffering. Not getting what one desires, suffering. And the Buddha said, in short, the five aggregates of clinging are suffering. Now, the five aggregates of clinging are material form, rupa, feeling, vedana, perception, sanya, mental formation, sankara, and consciousness, vijnana. The material form, that's rupa, represents the physical aspect of the body, while feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness represent various mental actions. And all the five aggregates are conditioned dhammas. So that means they arise and pass away constantly from moment to moment, and they are in a state of flux with no stable or permanent entity. And we have no ownership or control over them. The Buddha said, what we call a person or an individual is made up of these five aggregates. But through our ignorance, we attach to the aggregates and we identify them as I or me. And that, of course, leads to suffering when they change and we have no control over them. Now, five aggregates by themselves are not the cause of suffering, but it is our attachment and clinging to them that leads to suffering. Now, enlightened arahants, they also have the five aggregates, but they have no suffering because they have no attachments to the aggregates. In Dukkha Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, that's a collection of the Buddha's connected discourses. The Buddha described three different types of suffering. Firstly, suffering due to physical pain or mental distress. Dukkha. Secondly, suffering due to the inherent nature of change, that is viparinama dukkha. And thirdly, suffering due to the impermanent nature of all conditioned physical and mental phenomena, sankhara dukkha. Now, suffering due to physical pain or mental distress is what we already know as physical and mental pain, and every human being experiences it with no exception. And Buddha mentioned them while the Buddha was describing suffering as the first noble truth. Now, suffering due to the inherent nature of change, viparinama dukkha, and that is the suffering caused by the constant change in nature of all phenomena. Any happiness, pleasure, comfort, security that we experience, they are all temporary and they will end. And that causes inevitable suffering. Now, those pleasant experiences are a result of certain other causes and conditions. And when those preceding conditions change or cease, the pleasure also ceases. The more one expects to have those pleasures or attachment to them means we are creating more unhappiness, more disappointment, more suffering for ourselves. Now, suffering due to the impermanent nature of all conditioned physical and mental phenomena, the sankhara dukkha, and this is the suffering that's caused due to the impermanence and not self nature of all conditioned things. And the sankhara dukkha is unique to the Buddhist doctrine. And it's the most subtle form of suffering. And it's a suffering that most will find it difficult to understand. Now, all physical and mental phenomena in this universe are conditioned by causes and conditions, and their nature is impermanence, suffering, and not self. Now, when the Buddha said the five aggregates are suffering, the Buddha was referring to this sankhara dukkha. There's a book called Dhammapada. That's the book of the Buddha saying in verses. And there are 423 verses in the Dhammapada. In the verse 278, the Buddha said, Sabbe sankara dukkati yada panyaya passati at nibbindati dukkhe esamaggo visuddhiya. All sankhara, all conditioned things are suffering. When one sees this with wisdom, one comes out of suffering. And that is the path to purity. The second noble truth is the origin of suffering, and Buddha declared that as craving, tanha. Craving is the intense desire that can never be satisfied. The craving can be to seek pleasurable experiences or to get rid of unpleasant experiences. And this craving is due to ignorance, and the ignorance of the true nature of conditioned phenomena. And that is, they are impermanent, suffering, and lacks any substantiality. But due to our ignorance and perverted thinking, we consider impermanent as permanent, suffering as satisfactory and pleasurable, and not self as self. In the Buddha's first discourse, while describing the second noble truth, the Buddha described three types of craving. Craving for sensual pleasures, kama tanha, craving for becoming, bhava tanha, and craving for non-becoming, vibhava tanha. Now, craving for sensual pleasures is the intense desire to have sensual pleasures from the sense objects that we receive through the six sense doors. That's the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, body, and the mind. In the Vibhanga Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha described six types of craving for sensual pleasures. And that is craving for pleasant visible forms that we see through the eyes, craving for pleasant sounds, craving for pleasant odors, craving for pleasant taste, craving for pleasant tactile objects, and craving for pleasant mental phenomena. But craving for becoming or existence, now bhava means being, becoming, to exist. So bhavatanha is craving to become something or someone in this life, or it can be craving to continue to exist in future lives. And craving for non-becoming is the desire to get rid of something, and that includes the desire not to exist after death. And this desire to get rid of something may be for one to get rid of something that one does not like or cannot cope with, or some unbearable physical or mental pain, suffering, or even unpleasant people or situations. Suicide may be an extreme form of vibhavatanha. Now, during the process of enlightenment, the Buddha also realized dependent origination, that's paticca samuppada. And through paticca samuppada, the Buddha saw how suffering arises. There are 12 factors, 12 conditioned and conditioning factors in the dependent origination that gives rise to suffering. And the Buddha said, conditioned by ignorance, mental formations arise. Conditioned by mental formations, consciousness arises. Conditioned by consciousness, mind and matter arises. Conditioned by mind and matter, 6 sense bases arise. Conditioned by 6 sense bases, contact arises. Conditioned by contact, feeling arises. Conditioned by feeling, craving arises. Conditioned by craving, clinging arises. Conditioned by clinging, becoming arises. Conditioned by becoming, birth arises. And because of birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair arises. And that is all forms of suffering. And the Buddha also said, in the reverse order of dependent origination, by eradicating ignorance through true wisdom, the other factors will also cease to arise, eradicating all suffering. Now, how to eradicate suffering? Now, the Buddha's third noble truth of cessation of suffering is that suffering can be completely eradicated by remainderless fading and ceasing, giving up, relinquishing, letting go, and rejecting of all forms of craving. And that is the state of Nibbana, the sublime state beyond all suffering, a state of complete peace, joy, and happiness. Now, Nibbana is a supramundane state, so it cannot be described in any conventional language. It can be attained in this life itself. So it is not something that one can attain only after death. And once one attains Nibbana, that's also the end of the cycle of birth and death, samsara, with no more rebirth. Now, the fourth noble truth of the path leading to the end of suffering is the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Buddha also described it as the middle path. This Noble Eightfold Path is unique to the Buddhist doctrine. The Buddha discovered it during the process of enlightenment and declared to the world so that others can also cultivate it and liberate themselves from suffering. And the Noble Eightfold Path provides practical steps that anyone can follow and cultivate in order to attain enlightenment and liberation from suffering. There are 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, samadhi; right intention, samma sankappa; right speech, samma vacha; right action, samma kammanta; right livelihood, samma ajiva; right effort, samma vayama; right mindfulness, samma sati; and right concentration, samma samadhi. Now, for practical purposes, these 8 factors can be divided into 3 groups. The first group is morality, sila, and that consists of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The second group is concentration, samadhi, and that consists of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The third group is wisdom, panya, and that consists of right understanding, and right intention. Now, when one cultivates the Noble Eightfold Path successfully with diligence as advised by the Buddha, the final result is enlightenment or Nibbana. And one attains full enlightenment or Nibbana through 4 progressive supramundane stages. The first stage is stream enterer, Sotapanna. Second stage is once returner, Sakadagami. Third stage is non-returner, Anagami. And the final stage of enlightenment is Arahant. So an Arahant has completely eradicated all forms of suffering, has attained Nibbana with no more rebirth in the cycle of birth and death, samsara. Now, the Buddha discovered the path of liberation from suffering, that's a Noble Eightfold Path, during the process of enlightenment. And during the ministry of 45 years, the Buddha went around India teaching it to others so that they can also cultivate it and liberate themselves of suffering. And it has been practiced for the past 26 centuries. Innumerable numbers of human and celestial beings have cultivated it and eradicated suffering to attain the state of Nibbana. It is still possible for us to eradicate suffering if we cultivate the Noble Eightfold Path with effort and diligence as advised by the Buddha. The Buddha has often said, I teach only 2 things, suffering and end of suffering. Now, the Buddha did not deny that as human beings, we can experience different types of pleasures and happiness. But the Buddha's message was that all the pressures that we experience are all conditioned, they are all transient and impermanent. So if one craves for them or get attached to them, that can only lead to suffering and continued existence in the cycle of birth and death, the samsara. Now, because of the prominence that's been given to the concept of suffering in the Buddhist teaching, some believe that Buddhism is a negative and pessimistic teaching. Buddha showed the universality of suffering and its causes. But the Buddha also reassured us that suffering can be totally eradicated, and Buddha showed us the path to achieve it and attain final liberation. So Buddhism is in fact a positive and optimistic teaching. Thank you very much.